Thank you so much. If we have time for Q&A at the end, you will have to phrase your questions in the form of answers. It's the only way I know how to respond to them. So thank you. Funnily enough, I'm actually the second person from Kankakee, Illinois to be on the stage this morning, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I know you've already heard from Joe earlier today talking about millennials and talking about migration, and I know Robin Chase, who's a colleague of mine, has talked to you about mobility, and I'm hoping here as we reach the close of the session that I'm going to try to fuse these ideas together. Because I'm currently working on a project which I'll talk a bit about, looking where the millennials will go to raise their families. And I differ a little bit from Joe in the sense of I think that they're going to try to urbanize the suburbs, which we'll talk a bit about blurring the line between these two typologies and not just moving to smaller cities, which I think is more of his hypothesis if I understand it. So I want to get in here because I commonly get labeled as a futurist, and I always think of that when I think of the notion that sometimes futurists give you more than just airy theories. They give you a real vision of the future and where it can go, and sometimes it really inspires that future. So Futurama, 1939, 1940 at the World's Fair. I live in Queens, not far from the fairgrounds. Probably the most influential design exercise in American history, if not the world, because that's where Norman Bel Geddes, the designer, really conjured up the vision of the auto-driven suburbia that we would build after the war. Of course, General Motors was the one that really sort of promoted this and hired him to build an entire miniature city filled with superhighways, filled with skyscrapers. We'll come back to briefly, but this is really where they unveiled the notion of autonomous vehicles for the first time. It's not a new idea, a very old one. But soon after that vision, after 75 million people went through and got buttons that said, "I've seen the future," we started building it. So, of course, you had William Levitt built Levittown in 1947, building the sort of notion of reimagining new types of construction and financing and outfitting these homes to create an entirely new model of way of living. This entire kit of parts that could be replicated. I mean, I think of Levittown as sort of the first experiments in modular housing, or what we think of modularity. Soon after that, of course, Victor Gruen, the Austrian emigre, who wanted to basically build Vienna in the American suburbs, instead, of course, built Southdale Center, the first American modern enclosed mall as we know it, and therefore sort of took downtown and, of course, led to the rise of retail across America. Of course, a lot of that retail has, of course, fallen on hard times. Nothing lasts forever. My friend Will McIntosh, who's the chief economist of USA Realco, likes to say that America is not over-retailed, it's under-demolished. And so we'll get into some of these stats, but if you want a good time, go out to malls like deadmalls.com. The mall I grew up going to as a kid, Lincoln Mall, outside in the exurban periphery of Chicago, is archetypal dead mall. And here in Washington, I was here last week as part of this research project I'm working on, and I went to see one of a site that may matter only to me. This is perhaps the iconographic dead suburban office park building, 6116 Executive Boulevard in sort of North Bethesda, Rockville. I actually met a guy a few years ago giving a talk similar to this who was there, who was the leasing agent. He said, "Oh man, in 2004 when we leased it, it was great. It was 99.2% occupied. Today it's 98% vacant. I literally went and peered in the windows there, and they've rehabbed the building. It's still empty." That's sort of like a tombstone, I always like to think of it. But that's sort of the archetypal of sort of this entire typology of edge cities that we built that are now lying fallow in large swaths of the United States. And if you go to New Jersey, that's a particularly interesting site to see. Their Plan Smart New Jersey is a smart growth group that sort of put together this whole plan, what they called stranded assets, and looking at the fact that, there's 5 Empire State Buildings of empty office parks, 7 central parks of essentially vacant land around these various facilities. And the fact that, that basically high housing prices and an aging population has not created the sort of entry-level affordability for young people to come in and find jobs there. And so basically there's all these missing jobs. A whole cycle broken of suburbia. So, I always come back to the notion of the leopard. If you saw the book or the Visconti film with Burt Lancaster, if we want everything to stay the same, we must change. We must reinvent ourselves as we go along. And so I'm very curious about how the suburbs where I grew up, I've been a New Yorker for 20 years, but how are the suburbs, which is really, of course, the majority of America, how are we going to change and transform those? So before we get into that question, we got to look at what's already changed. How is the landscape changing underneath our feet? Well, the first thing is that the urban tide, the rising notion that millennials were going to be a special urban generation and move back to cities, the Richard Florida hypothesis. Well, that tide has turned again. So this is some data from Jed Kolko, who's an economist, studies real estate and job creation. The main takeaway from this graph is that only for a brief moment after the financial crisis, in 2011, you can see that thick blue line. That was the only time, really the only time since the post-war era, that dense urban counties were actually growing faster than the suburban counties, where we could really claim to say that cities were winning, if you could actually say that. But really, it's like what really have suffered is some of the smaller metros, right? They've suffered during the downturn, but we've seen the decline there is that the mid-size and the smaller ones have sort of rebounded a little bit. But it's still the large metro growth in population is what's driving the post-war, the post-financial crisis recovery here. And you can sort of see population change by place type. Large metro, low-density suburbs, that is being the big attractors. Every city in Texas, looking across the Sun Belt, that's where people are going to follow the jobs, which we'll cover in a little bit. And the smaller and mid-sized metros, which I guess Joe talked a bit about, they're the ones who have suffered. They're the ones who are having bleeding population loss. And let's not even talk about farm areas continuing to empty out. But to me, this is the most interesting part, right, is the fact that, yeah, when it comes to components of population change, people are leaving the dense urban counties of these large cities, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, and they're moving to the suburban areas of the large metros in the South. A much smaller percentage of immigrants are now actually sort of arriving there. You can sort of see large metros and basically the immigrants are choosing these sort of higher density suburbs as well. But that's a much smaller phenomenon in terms of pure population. And looking at county population growth by educational attainment, yes, basically the people who are moving to cities are the most highly educated millennials. They're choosing this. But basically lower educated, they're being displaced out of these cities into some of the inner ring suburbs, which we'll also talk a bit about. But yeah, if you just want to look at raw aggregate numbers, you can see, here's the top metros for population growth. I'll have to update this to 2018 when the numbers come in, but you can sort of see, right? We talk about the money that's moving to cities, but people are going to the Orlandos, Las Vegas, Dallas-Fort Worth, all big job centers for entry-level jobs for younger people. So what do the most successful metros have in common? So this goes beyond just the pure numbers of people to actually looking at, yeah, where is the money going in this one? And I was in Washington last week as part of my project, and while I was here, I met with Chris Lineberger, who is at the business school at George Washington University, at Brookings, and Lineberger, he was the one who really led me to the notion that it's not about cities versus suburbs. It's about walkable places. If you want to see where you're going to have some of the highest rents in any given metro area, look for where there's walkability. And he spent the last decade or so building up his own metric, combining data he gets from CoStar with WalkScore, with various metrices to put together his notion of walk-ups, these walkable urban places that are often found in downtowns or places like Brooklands, let's say, but can be found out in the suburbs. And he's focused on developers who are building them. He himself is currently developing and has for a decade King of Prussia Town Center in Pennsylvania, trying to build a dense walkable urban district next to the King of Prussia Mall. But as you can see here, if you can see the small print enough, yeah, usual suspects up there in the current rankings. Some of the largest cities, including here, Metro Washington is up there. And America's most sprawling cities in the top 30 metros are down at the bottom. Interestingly enough, including Orlando, which, a big suburban magnet for millennials. But here when he graphs it out, you can actually see, and I would certainly not argue causality, but you can see high correlation that, again, the most highly educated people, they're choosing walkability. The people with the highest per capita per GDP, they're choosing the most walkable cities in this. And that maps to what we've seen since the financial crisis, where the vast majority of job growth is being generated in some of the densest parts of America's handful of superstar cities. I saw a stat yesterday that basically Queens, where I live, has had more job creation in the last 10 years than the entire state of Pennsylvania. That's probably a reason why Amazon chose to make it a location for HQ 2.5 until we drove it away. But you can sort of see here share of metro regions and new income properties. So this is part of his thing is that basically he's been charting the last few cycles, and Lineberger has shown here that basically, yeah, more and more money in these various cities is flowing into the most walkable urban districts away from the edge city suburbias. And my friend Ellie Feingold, who's at Metaprop, who's their entrepreneur in residence, he took, and this is a time series where he basically took RCL Co's indices for multifamily, and this is one for office, mapped it against a combination of walk score, bike score, and transit score rolled up together. And you can see here that since the financial crisis, there's been a divergence where the most walkable cities and also the most highly walkable suburban areas have had the highest increases in rent. You can see walkability diverging away from non-walkable areas. And this is, of course, even more true for the multifamily housing markets as well. So there's definitely a correlation happening here where we're seeing this focus. And here in Washington, of course, which is really where it all began, I was talking to Lineberger, he's like, my wife and I, we could have moved anywhere years ago, and she wanted to move to Paris, but I wanted to be here in Washington because this is where it's at. And it's true, like Tyson's Corner is probably the spiritual heart of America in terms of actually driving real estate patterns over the last 30 or 40 years. And you can see this is his map of walkable urban places in greater Washington. So you've got Tyson's out to the west, you've got the suburbs of Arlington County along the metro, big growth corridor going out into Maryland, of course, along the metro line there, through Silver Spring and Bethesda, and out into Germantown, and through Rockville, and so forth. And of course, the unfavored corridor there with Anacostia, and looking at sort of the impoverished districts of the city to the southeast. What I thought was really interesting is I took a recent paper, this is by some researchers, who wanted to see where job growth goes to. So in this paper, they took the Inc. 5000, which is the 5,000 fastest growing firms in America, mapped it against the EPA keeps an index called the Vibrant Places Index, or I guess the Diversity Index, which looks at all sorts of factors of what makes a diverse place. And then they mapped them out, and this is what they found. So if you actually look, if you pardon my Mac Paint overlay, but they found something very similar, that the fastest growing employers, they don't care if they're in the city or they're in the suburbs, but they want to be attracted to those same vibrant, walkable places where the millennials are going. And so I thought that was really interesting, that they, like Lineberger, are not making a distinction between what is urban and what is suburban. They're just choosing this. And if you go to Atlanta, you see the same sort of thing, right? You see plenty of firms cluster in the downtown, but you see these growth corridors going out to Marietta, of course, going out through Sandy Springs into Alpharetta, which is, of course, a big district, and going out to the east as well. These are the cities they happen to map. I'm sure we could see the same problem, with the same pattern going over and over and over in various cities.